In today's episode, we are still years away from the first collections of the new Washington state income tax, assuming it is not repealed by the people or overturned by the courts. But the Washington Department of Revenue is gearing up to launch a major hiring campaign. 300 some government paid employees are needed to make sure that millionaires are not skirting the tax and to make sure that the wealth is redistributed as it is supposed to based on the new income tax. So we're going to dive into that. It turns out you can make a pretty good living under the new income tax to qualify for the tax subsidy. Far more than many of us make in the state of Washington to qualify for this redistribution of wealth. So we're going to dive into that a bit. So let's dive in. As Washington prepares to collect its first ever income tax on millionaires, one state agency is gearing up for a major hiring blitz to handle the administrative workload of ensuring that millionaires pay what they owe. Now, the tax does not officially get collected until 2029. So, based on earnings in 2028, what millionaires earn or small businesses with pass through administration that are effective or going to be affected by this income, it does not kick in until 2029 taxes owed. But the Department of Revenue is planning to hire more than 300 new government employees over the next few years, with the first of those employees to be hired this summer. Let's Go Washington founder Brian Haywood, in a Friday morning interview with the Center Square, basically said he has no doubt that Department of Revenue in this massive hiring ramp up is, in his opinion, an indication that they well expect the tax is going to eventually be a tax on all Washington income earners. And on Thursday, Washington State Attorney General Rob McKenna, Citizen Action Defense Fund, and former Supreme Court Justice Phil Talmadge filed a lawsuit in Klickitat County Superior Court challenging the newly enacted income tax, arguing it is, in fact, unconstitutional. And here is some of what Rob McKenna said.
Is income property? This is not an abstract issue. This was decided by the voters of Washington State when they enacted Amendment 14 to the Constitution in 1930. And the express purpose of that amendment was to expand the definition of property to cover everything, whether tangible or intangible, subject to ownership. And income meets all three of those tests. And every Supreme Court panel that's looked at the question has reached the same conclusion. Income is subject to ownership. It is part of everything. It is an intangible. So this decision was not decided by philosophers. This decision that income is property was decided by the voters of Washington State, who wanted a property tax that would be as extensive as possible, that would reach every form of intangible property: stocks, bonds, money, income, all of it. That's why they didn't put a list of items in the definition of property that said, well, this is property, and this is property, and this is property. They said everything, tangible and intangible, subject to ownership, is property. So unless you think you don't have an ownership interest in your income, you have to see that income, in fact, is part of property. Now, in 1934, just a year after the first Supreme Court decision striking down a graduated income tax, the voters had a chance to amend the Constitution again. They were presented with a constitutional amendment that would have excluded income from the definition of property. They rejected it by a wide margin. And just as they rejected 5 subsequent constitutional amendments that would have made a graduated income tax possible. So the voters clearly preferred this broad definition of property that encompasses income from just within, reaffirmed that within just a few years of the original amendment being adopted.
Now, Haywood and Let's Go Washington have their own legal challenge to the income tax proceeding on a separate path, pushing for voters to have a chance to weigh in. The Attorney General has to respond by today to LGW is what they call a writ of mandamus or writ of mandamus, however you pronounce that word. And then they have until next Tuesday to respond officially to that response from the AG. And then it goes to the entire Supreme Court on April 30th, and we will be there sitting in the state Supreme Court. There will be arguments made from all of the players in this as to why Let's Go Washington believes this is fair for them to move forward with a referendum based on the fact that they don't think the state constitution allows state lawmakers to move forward with a referendum proof bill. This was Senate Bill 6346 signed into law. They made it referendum proof, saying it was an emergency. It was necessary to implementation of the budget. They believe that is not a fair reading of the state constitution, and that is the challenge. So Haywood also notes the Constitution as actually written. I want to read this to you because I think this is key to the arguments that are going to be played out before the state Supreme Court. Haywood notes the Constitution reads, "Accept such laws as may be necessary for the immediate preservation of the public peace, health, or safety, support of the state government and its existing public institutions." You can't put a referendum on a bill. Secretary of State Steve Hobbs reads it differently or has a different interpretation that's going to be argued before the state Supreme Court, saying it doesn't have to be both, has to be one or the other, has to be an emergency or has to be necessary to implement the budget. Doesn't have to be both. That is the crux of the argument that will be before the state Supreme Court. So that's going to be key for this moving forward.